recovery ushered me into a life that I don't think I could have accessed had I not gone through what I went through. And that's why I am grateful that I was born with an addictive gene or brain or however you want to say it, because it gave me something that I don't believe I would have had otherwise. You guys have heard me say it before, but never living fine, always living fully. I believe that it is very easy for people to fall into this cruise control, mediocre, in the middle way of living. And recovery taught me that I would so much rather live fully than live fine. I know that the lowest lows brought me to the highest highs. And I also know that I'm strong enough to deal with the thing at hand that I need to walk through. And I know what's on the other side because I've experienced in my life, in my recovery, and in 10 years of sobriety. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Living Fully podcast. I'm excited to bring you guys this episode today. It's one that I think has been a long time coming in Q&As. Everyone's always asking questions about recovery and addiction and my own personal journey with that. And today we decided to put together an episode that's really important to me because you know that recovery, I feel like, ushered me into the most beautiful life ever. And so what we did was we boiled down the 10 things that I have learned in 10 years of recovery. So let's address the first thing, and then it has been 10 years. March 26th, it was 10 years that I've been sober from prescription pills and alcohol. It's a story that I didn't really fully tell until my book Living Fully came out, and it's one that I'm really proud of, and I've found a lot of connection to a lot of people through, and something that I'm asked about a lot, because if you are not a person that's struggling with something, be it addiction or an emotional issue of some sort, I'm certain that you know someone who is struggling with that. I don't know that I've ever met a person in my life that doesn't know someone who's walked this road or maybe needs to take a step onto this road or has been affected by addiction in some way. So there are things that I learned in my time at Karen Treatment Centers is where I went. There is absolutely no tie or deal with them. We paid full price to go there, but I do like to share where I went to treatment because I think a lot of people are like my family in that you kind of don't know where to turn. You kind of don't know the good places to go or where to begin. And I'll dive into just a tiny bit of my journey. If this is the first podcast that you're listening to, I dealt with a prescription pill addiction and alcohol there at the end for a few years in my 20s. It was like hard and fast, really started and ended in a short amount of time, but it almost took my life. It was that severe. And my family was the one that stepped in because they realized that something in me had changed. And it happened really fast. And my family had never dealt with addiction or getting someone into treatment or recovery in any way, shape, or form. So they found themselves asking people a really uncomfortable question for them and just going on to Google and just being like, what are the good places to send people? What does that even look like? And that was kind of our journey into it. I spent 5.5 months in treatment in 2014, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me. And these are the 10 things that I've learned in 10 years of sobriety that I wanted to share with you guys today on this podcast. And the first one that I will share is, number one, the problem that presents itself is never usually the issue. It's usually something underneath that drove you to the addiction or whatever the problem that presents itself. I wrote this in my book, but I want to read this. I opened my book with a story about these hair extensions. And when I was in treatment, they made me take my hair extensions out. This is a story that if you've listened to any of my content or read my books, you've probably heard. But what this story alludes to in this point that I've learned about recovery is that when they removed my last hair extension, I had like this full out-of-body experience because I was so attached to the way that I looked physically and to the person that I had been for the past 10 years of my life that it was my breaking point. Taking out my hair extensions was my breaking point. And that was a really big shift for me in my journey of recovery, because it taught me and my counselors there and everybody around me that was trying to help me in my journey there, how deeply attached I was to my appearance. And that was something that we needed to work through, because you don't just pick up a drink or pick up a medication and you start using it addictively. It's always something that led you there. And to me, it was my perfectionistic tendencies. It was this attachment to this person that I'd become that had really gotten a lot worse in my years of doing Miss America and all those things. And that was revealed to me through that. I wrote this in my book, Living Fully. It's something that I've now come to understand after years of self-reflection. The issue that manifests is rarely the actual problem. There's usually an underlying cause that's not being addressed. The problem for me wasn't the substances. The problem wasn't the hair, the boyfriend, the titles, the success, the notoriety, the need for approval, or anything else. The problem, my problem, was my attachment to all these things. And so that is something that I've learned in my time in recovery, is that the problem that presents itself is never usually the issue. It's what's underneath. So if you have a child that you see this same thing popping up over and over, or you have a spouse, or you have a friend, or you have a parent, pay attention to that thing that continues to pop up and rear its ugly head, because a lot of times there is something underneath that they need to work through, which is why I'm such a proponent of long-term recovery. 30 days you can get sober, I think, but I spent 5.5 months there dealing with what was underneath that problem. So that is point number one. Point number two, and this is one that you hear a lot of times in like the rooms of AA, or you hear at treatment centers, or you just hear in people talking about recovery in general. It is that recovery is done in community and that it requires a village. I think that we hear that a lot of times about motherhood and raising kids, that like motherhood requires a village and things like that. But I want to speak about it today a little bit in terms of recovery, because recovery or addiction is a really isolating thing. Especially the further along it gets, it can become like a one-man show in a lot of people's lives. And it became that way for me. And oftentimes you start to isolate yourself from your community. And oftentimes your community does not see you getting darker and darker and darker and deep into this hole. So it's a really foreign thing to think about, oh, well, I got to bring all these people that I've just isolated from my life back in to get help. And so many times we're so shame-filled and we're so embarrassed, and we want people to remember the person that we were before we were in active addiction this deep. We don't really want them to see us in this place. But the reality is you have to let people see you in this place in order to get help. And, like I said, my family was my village who identified that there was a problem and helped get me into treatment. And there was a time where I stood in front of my entire family and I kind of brought them into this really dark part of my story. My family who had seen only the shiny parts of my story. And that was really hard. And I was really nervous and apprehensive in each of these settings because the people like surrounding me had really looked up to me and like they were so proud of the person that I'd become. But what it taught me, and something that I really learned in recovery, and why I'm making this one of my 10 points, is because you need the support of other people. And maybe it's not your family. Maybe you are estranged from your family. But there are rooms of AA where there is a really tight-knit community. There are friendships that I think can really weather these types of storms. I just think that it is imperative to have community around you in order to recover. Okay, this is one of my favorite ones that I have learned, and this is something that 10 years into recovery, I still do. And this is a very like recovery way to say it, and it's something that people say oftentimes that's like one of those just like classic recovery phrases. But let me explain it. So the phrase is play the tape. What play the tape means is when you start to romanticize the thing that destroyed your life, be it an emotional issue or alcohol or drugs or whatever it was, or a bad relationship or a terrible job or whatever it is, to play the tape through. So think about it like you start at the beginning of the song and like, oh yeah, familiar song. Oh, it's not that bad. Okay, play the whole story. Remember what that thing did to your life. Because there are times where we will get weak in our recovery journeys, or we will think to ourselves, you know what, it's been 3 years, or it's been 6 months, or it's been 10 years. Maybe I could reconnect with that ex-boyfriend, or maybe I could have a glass of wine and it would all be fine. Play the tape all the way through to the end and remember how that thing destroyed your life. Do not romanticize the things that ruined your life. Play the tape. Okay, another point, and another thing that I have really learned in recovery that is another one of those recovery-y phrases is open the mail. So they used to say this, and I remember hearing it in treatment. I was like, what are you even talking about? Are they referring to bills? Like, what are you talking about? Open the mail. Open the mail means, think of it as you go to your mailbox and you've got like this stack of bills. Say like you're $50,000. Say you're $500,000 in debt. And you just keep stacking these bills on the counter on top of each other, on top of each other, on top of each other. You don't want to open the mail because this is a mountain of a problem. And this is like something that can remind you of a larger problem by just opening the mail. In recovery, it is very encouraged to not continue to ignore your problems because that will keep you sick. So brushing things under the rug or ignoring things that are blatantly happening in your life is something that you cannot do and stay sober. So they say, open the mail over and over. Face your problems. Don't be afraid to be reminded of your problems, because guess what we have to do in recovery? We have to face our problems. So this is an excerpt from my book that I want to read that's kind of about opening the mail. And I think that I wrote it well in my book, so I want to read through it again, because this is something that, even if you're not dealing with addiction, I think this is something that can be for anybody who tends to not want to deal with their problems and wants to brush things under the rug. Because living in this way is something I learned in recovery, but I use a lot in my everyday life, and I think you can too. When I was in early recovery, I learned the term open the mail. It's a metaphor that represents the tiny tasks that we don't face right away because we don't want to be reminded of a larger issue at hand. We don't want to open the letter or the package because we're afraid it's a notice of some bigger issue we'll have to handle. So we let it sit unopened and we ignore our problems for a while. But sometimes getting the simplest tasks done, opening the mail, can completely change our mindset. Then, once you get into the practice of facing little things head on rather than letting them pile up in some corner of your home, you become a person who automatically opens the mail rather than avoids it. I eventually became that person, and ultimately it freed me from an invisible prison in which I'd been slowly withering away. I know that's a really dramatic way to say that, but I do feel that we can trap ourselves in a prison by ignoring the problems that are controlling our lives. We become victims of our own environments, even if it's not victims of our own addiction. And I think opening the mail is a really powerful thing that you, just listening to this podcast, can take away. And then I promise you, eventually it becomes the way that you live your life. It becomes the way that you think. You don't brush things under the rug. You face things head on. And it is a very freeing way to live. So, open the mail. All right, next. This one is, to this day, the hardest that I have had to deal with, and the thing that I have to relearn over and over because I really care about setting an example and being a good person and how people view me. And so this was the hardest one for me. Forgiving yourselves and others in order to move forward. Okay, so I have always been, we grew up all together on this farm, and I was the oldest of all my cousins, the oldest of my siblings. I was always one that wanted to set an example. I was really proud of the person that I was as a young person. My family was proud of me. It was something that I always took pride in, the person that I was and the good person that I was. And when I started to go down the road of active addiction, after I had achieved a lot of things in my life and made people really proud, I carried the heaviest weight of shame around my neck every single day. I didn't even want to think about the ways that I was toward the people that I loved and the ways that people saw me at the end. because I just like wanted to pretend like it didn't even happen, because I couldn't forgive myself for that. I felt embarrassed about it, and I felt like it kind of erased all of the good things that I'd done in the past. But something that I learned in my time in recovery, and in particular in doing the 12 steps, which are these 12 steps that you take on your way out of any addiction, is that forgiving yourselves, forgiving others, and allowing others to forgive you is a massively huge part of getting sober or getting well. There was something that you do immediately when you are trying to recover, and that is your family will write you these impact letters, and it basically tells you like what your addiction has done to them. And there was some members of my family that were like, I can't write this. Like, I can't do it. Like, I know she's going to take it really hard. They kind of want to look the other way too. But it was something that my counselors and everything were like, you guys, you have to tell her so that she will remember what this did to her. So that, on those days where it's really hard and she thinks, maybe it wasn't that bad, she will remember where it took her. She will remember what it did to you. And she will remember why she wants to stay sober. And so forgiveness is such a big piece in moving forward. Forgiving myself is something that was probably hard, but forgiving others is pretty easy for me. But the piece of like having them forgive me, like accepting that, I just like felt so much guilt over that. But it's a really important thing that I've learned from recovery that I use in my life, even, on a day-to-day basis. You guys have heard me say this before, but it is absolutely in 10 things that I've learned from recovery. It's something that I learned from my grandpa. The adversity that he experienced in his life was not the same as the adversity that I experienced. But adversity can lend to the same thing, which is if you can make it through it, you will be made the person that you are through that thing. And it is something that I learned in treatment, because that was the hardest thing I ever went through in my life. And it was the first time that I had really experienced like a life or death thing. And it was really tough. That was a really tough time for me. So I learned that lesson. Recovery taught me this lesson of you didn't make it through this, you were made through this. I'd always seen that in my grandpa, because I'd always wondered, how has he been through so much in his life? And he's this amazing, incredible, beautiful person. But going through these things is what makes us these people. And that's something that recovery certainly taught me. You become a better person through it. You become more resilient. I am better equipped to face so many different situations because of what I went through in my time in treatment, trying to get sober from a drug addiction. So that is something that I've learned, and that's something that I carry into my life and that I tell people all the time, because I want people to have the strength to face adversity and not only look at the negative of like, oh gosh, I'm about to have to climb this mountain, but that they see it in a positive light of, oh, I remember this thing that this girl said about recovery and adversity, that like this shining light that I will get on the other side. Something that I've learned in 10 years of sobriety is that the hardest part for the people who love you on the outside is to not continue to enable the behavior that eventually can end the person in active addiction's life. People hear the word boundaries over and over and over, and I think some people talk about boundaries incorrectly, and some people use it in ways that it maybe doesn't need to be used. But what is really important in what I've learned is that if the people who genuinely really loved me had continued to enable my behavior and be like, you know what, she's strong, she can get through this, or they had continued to look the other way and say, it's actually not that bad, or they had not put forth the boundaries of, if you continue to do this, like you can't we will not do this for you, or we will not continue to blank, whatever that is. I don't know what your boundary is, but what I do know is it is really hard for the people that love you the most to not enable the behavior. And I carried this into my life because I saw it so strongly as the person in active addiction. My dad, he thought that I could get through it on my own. And my mom was like, no, she needs professional help. And had my dad won that argument, I wouldn't be sitting here in this chair or in your speakers coming through your car today on this podcast. That is how serious and grave my situation had gotten. And he was well-meaning and like loved me just as much as my mom did. But it was really, really hard for him because his love manifested in that way. He just felt like it wasn't that bad and I could make it through it. So what I want to say, and here's what I want to say too, if you are a person that has a person in your life that you know needs help, and it is just a struggle and a battle and something that you are having just the toughest time with every day, you have to put those boundaries and those like ultimatums in place a lot of times, or they have no reason to get better. If you're continuing to allow their life to remain the same, they're going to keep going down that road, and that road ultimately sometimes leads to a really bad thing. And so I even put this into practice as a parent, because sometimes it's so hard to parent toddlers, and I don't want, 4 to 6, and it is just so much easier to maybe just give in, and like if they're being punished from TV or something like that, to be like, you know what, oh my gosh, I've got 10,000 things going on. Would it be really easy to end this punishment 2 days early and just be like, okay, you can turn on the TV for 30 minutes, but I'm enabling a behavior. And it's something that I certainly learned in recovery, that it's really important to stand our ground. And it's really integral in recovery for the person that is in active addiction. Something else that I am asked often about in Q&As, and I believe is a challenge for people as they are living life as a sober person, is being around, say you have issues with alcohol. You go back into the real world, and the reality is we can't change the people around us, and we shouldn't have to change the people around us in order for us to stay sober. We should be strong enough in our recovery to be able to exist in the world and have the support that we need to enter into those circumstances, especially like once you've been in recovery for a while. I do believe that in the beginning, you need to remove that thing from your vicinity at least, and make it not as easily accessible on those days where you're feeling not as strong in your recovery. That was something that we did for several years for me. But what I've learned as I'm 10 years in is the reality is sometimes you're going to feel like the only person in the room. And when people ask me the question of, gosh, is it really hard to be around other people that are drinking when you're sober? I say no. It's not hard to be around them. Not like, oh man, that makes me really want that drink. I think that's some people's journey, but it's not mine. But sometimes I feel like the only person in the room. If every single person around me is drinking, or to the point of like everybody's drunk, you're on vacation or you're at a wedding reception, sometimes you feel like when you're having conversations with people who are just like in a totally different place than you are, you can feel like the only person in the room. And even if you're a person that doesn't like struggle, maybe you're not an alcoholic, but maybe you socially drink a lot and then all of a sudden you're pregnant. And it's like, you can probably relate to this feeling of you just feel like you are on a totally different planet when you're in the room with people that you love or your peers. And the challenge in that is that sometimes I can, like, you feel sorry for yourself a little bit. In the instances of, especially like whenever I'm dealing with a tough time and everybody else has an outlet where they can just drink 2 glasses of wine and they can at least like forget about it for 2 hours. It's, what I've learned in recovery is that dealing with your problems head on certainly is a way better way to deal with it. But that's my only option, And sometimes I will feel like, well, must be nice, But I play the tape through. And I remember that for me, the story doesn't end that way. When I have 2 glasses of wine, it ends in a far worse way. And when I feel like the only person in the room, especially early on, it's nice to have support. So have people that maybe are also in recovery. In the rooms of AA, you can have sponsorship, or maybe you have a friend that's like, do you have to drink at this party? Like, are you coming to this party with me? You have one person in the room at least. Kyle used to be that person for me for the first couple years that I was in recovery. We never had alcohol in our home for a while, but also he didn't drink at our wedding. And I think about that and I look back, and now he can drink and I'm around it and I'm fine, but I'm 10 years I'm a decade into recovery. But I think about that and what a special thing that was that he gave that up for me. On our wedding, he didn't drink a drop. I think that's something that I needed and that I wanted, because I didn't want to feel like the only person in the room at our wedding. And I wanted everybody else to have a great time and to enjoy themselves. It wasn't like I was just going to remove that from my environment because I needed it, because I wanted everybody else to have fun. But the fact that my husband gave that up for me on that night was a sacrifice that he gave up for me, but that was something that I felt much more connected to him on that night. And I just really appreciate that. I don't even know if I've ever told him that. I probably need to tell him that, because sometimes I do feel like the only person in the room full of people. And I think a lot of people feel like that in their lives. They just feel different. And I never felt different like that in my life, growing up. I always felt welcome in any room that I was in. I always felt strong and confident. So that was kind of the first time in my life where I felt different from people, not in a good way. And it's really kind of funny because I never drank growing up. I never drank in high school. I didn't drink in college. I didn't start drinking until the end. And I always felt very confident being the person that didn't drink. I just didn't. But then once I did bring that kind of into my life, it was kind of hard to go back. And then once I got sober, I did tend to feel like that. So anyways, that's something that I've certainly learned in 10 years of recovery. Okay, another thing that you hear, not only in people that are sober, but I think you hear this in motherhood, and you hear this in people that are in any sort of busy or hard or challenging season that also is rewarding, and that is one day at a time. So when people ask me the question of, well, will you never drink again? Because alcohol wasn't really my major issue. It was more prescription medication. And then you kind of have to give everything up whenever you're in recovery, or I believe you have to give everything up. And I always say no, I will never drink again. But what I have learned in recovery is maybe I shouldn't think like that. And I should think just for today, I'm not drinking. I'm kind of an all or nothing kind of person. So I think that's why I go immediately to no. But in recovery, it can seem so insurmountable, thinking of never ever having that thing again in your whole life. So I think that it makes it a little more digestible to think of it as one day at a time. And I think that you can use this in parenting. You can use this in a lot of, maybe you're in medical school, or you're, whatever that thing, you're building a business, you're post a divorce, one day at a time. Thinking about getting through that one day strong, getting through that one day, and then tomorrow is a new day. So recovery certainly taught me this, but it's something that I use certainly in my life every day. And this is the final of the 10 things that I've learned in 10 years of sobriety. And I know you've probably heard this again, but I have to say it because recovery ushered me into a life that I don't think I could have accessed had I not gone through what I went through. And that's why I am grateful that I was born with an addictive gene or brain, or however you want to say it, because it gave me something that I don't believe I would have had otherwise. And You guys have heard me say it before, but never living fine, always living fully. I believe that it is very easy for people to fall into this cruise control, mediocre, in the middle way of living. And it's a lot easier to think of just keeping things the same in your comfortable life than it is to deal with an issue at hand or push beyond the boundaries for something more. And recovery taught me that I would so much rather live fully than live fine, because I know that the lowest lows brought me to the highest highs. And I also know that I'm strong enough to deal with the thing at hand that I need to walk through. And I know what's on the other side because I've experienced in my life, in my recovery, and in 10 years of sobriety. So I'm forever grateful for what I experienced. And that's why I want to encourage anybody today that feels like it is just this mountain that they do not have the strength to climb. What's on the other side of that mountain is so vastly different and so much better than the pain that you're going to experience in going through what you have to go through to get to the other side. And if you are a parent or a spouse or a friend of someone that you know needs to climb that mountain, the pain that you will deal with and the strain on your relationship, the same thing. What you'll get on the other side and what that person will get on the other side is so much greater. So face your fears and face the thing and walk through it. That's why I continue to share this other side of recovery so much more than I talk about recovery in general. I never want to be like, a person that's making content out of recovery, because I just want to share the hope of what's on the other side. That's what I feel my space is. That's what I feel like I'm meant to share in this space and with this platform about recovery. It is just this bright, shiny, happy, beautiful thing that is on the other side of recovery. This life that I live in sobriety, but essentially it's just walking through hard things. So those are the 10 things that I have learned in 10 years of sobriety. And I'm so grateful for the community of people that made me feel safe enough to share my story and makes me feel proud of my story. And I really love hearing from people's messages. Like, they'll send me an email or they'll tell me if you meet me in the grocery store or in a DM of your journey in recovery and in sobriety, and especially the things that we relate to, or especially if something that I said helped you to take that first step into your journey in recovery. So, like I said, forever grateful for my 10 years in sobriety, and I'm thankful to share this because honestly, 5 years ago, I don't think that I would have really had the courage to share the nitty-gritty of being a sober person, and now I'm really proud of it. So, 10 things that I've learned, 10 years of sobriety. I hope you guys enjoyed this podcast. Thank you so much for listening. I have another podcast that is more of a Q&A of questions that you guys have asked for recovery or about recovery. That came out that we will relink. So make sure that you are tuned in and listening to that one as well, as if you like this type of podcast. So thank you guys so much for listening to this Living Fully podcast episode. Tune in next week for more.